This is Gender in Focus. I'm Elle, and each week I sit down with the president of Transfocus Consulting and all-round gender diversity genius, Kai Scott. I get to ask all the questions you've ever wanted to ask about how to make the workplace and the world a better place for trans and non-binary people. Let's get into it.
In today's episode, we're getting into nuances of Trans Day of Visibility, which happens every year on March 31st. We explore why it's important and what makes visibility tricky. I'm really excited to dive into this topic today with you, Elle. Hello, how are you doing?
Hello. Good, how are you?
I'm doing great.
I'm really excited about this topic because this is the one that everyone that I speak to at least, this is the one day that people just don't know anything about. A lot of people have heard of like Trans Day of Remembrance or General Pride. They have an idea of that, but Trans Day of Visibility is one that everyone seems to not know too much about. So could you tell us what it is exactly?
Yeah, it's such a good point that many folks have an understanding of a few different days that reoccur every year. But this one is, maybe a rising star in that constellation. And it was started by a trans activist named Rachel Crendel about 15 years ago. And it is intended as a complement to the Trans Day of Remembrance that occurs in November of each year.
Mm-hmm.
And just as a refresh, in case folks don't know what Trans Day of Remembrance, essentially we lose a lot of folks through transphobic violence. People are killed essentially for being trans, and we remember the people we've lost every year, which is just staggeringly high for such a small population, particularly among Black trans women. We lose a lot of folks, and so it's a deep mourning and very sad and tragic time. It does motivate us to keep continuing the work, but there's also a need to celebrate and the victories that we've had and the good progress that we're making, as well as people just living their everyday lives, right? That sadly is very kind of revolutionary for a lot of trans and non-binary folks. So that's why Rachel Crendel 15 years ago came up with the Trans Day of Visibility to offer an opportunity for folks, if they could and if they felt comfortable, to share more about themselves and who they are and what they represent, and what are their interests, and just so that we can showcase the diversity that exists within trans and non-binary people. And so this is a very important place for us to celebrate the important contributions of trans and non-binary folks on Trans Day Visibility.
You mentioned that this was sort of set up 15 years ago. And I think some of the discourse that's going on right now is that trans people have just sort of appeared in the last 5 years, and that we've just sort of popped into existence. And it's definitely spoken about like it's a sort of new thing that trans people exist. So when it comes to visibility, what does that actually look like?
Yeah, it's so true that, of course, trans and non-binary folks have always existed, but typically, especially in the past, and maybe even a bit more these days, have kind of lingered in the shadows of society,
Mm-hmm.
been very quiet or very subtle about who they are. Maybe they're not, denying or hiding actively, but they're not stating outwardly. And so that has pivoted as people feel society has somewhat been more accepting, although it depends on where you are, if that actually occurs. But then also people don't want to hide anymore or have to kind of curb or even code switch, who they're with, what they're going to say. They just want to live and speak openly about their experiences. So that can be sharing with folks that they're trans, maybe not hiding so much or being more open about what they did on the weekend, especially if it entailed something that involves the trans community. Maybe they got together in a spoken word and really want to talk about the themes. And so they're just not holding back in that way, in perhaps the ways that others have in the past, or for some for whom they do have to do that because maybe it's not safe for them to share. So it's, just being more open about one's life, or more open about the journey that somebody is taking related to gender affirming care, and not to have this be this kind of odd thing that happens. More, this is a normal part part of their lives, and having to make
Mhm.
decisions and thinking about and weighing options and whatnot. And so again, just not wanting to curb that part of their lives. But of course, trans folks and non-binary folks also make very important contributions, and being able to highlight those and to share, whether it's in the arts or in the trades or any other area of life, maybe they're a volunteer. So just being able to recognize the humanity in people, and that we're kind of everywhere, and an integral part of the communities we're in, and also in society more generally.
A lot of the conversations around trans issues and non binary issues are quite negative. They lead with a lot of the topics that you talked about at the beginning with Trans Day of Remembrance. And so I kind of wanted you to go into Trans Day of Visibility a bit more and why that's so important to kind of have this other side of the conversation.
Yeah, so true that, sometimes people can over-index on
Hmm.
the tragedy, and there is a lot of tragedy. That's the thing. It is very real,
Hmm.
but then lose the plot on the like positive, joyful aspects of being trans. And certainly, Trans Day of Visibility is that counterpoint to showing that trans people and non-binary folks can lead these very positive, meaningful, joyful lives, and that being trans and non-binary is a part of that. It's not like a separate thing that they have to kind of overcome or struggle with. It's an integral part of who they are and contributes to their ability to show up in their lives. I think about my own experience when I first came out. Like, there was a sudden integration of everything that I'd kind of shut out, being trans, and kind of hoped it would go away eventually, which never does. So once it's integrated and visible and affirmed by the folks around me, friends, family, in the workplace, then, just like, becoming 3D, fully formed. And to share one's story is such a powerful thing, and that includes the positive aspects, right? The things that people are excited about. Of course, it doesn't always have to be about being trans. People can be excited about, art, video games, volunteering, just all the everyday, almost banal things in their lives, right? But that makes somebody this fully formed human being. And so that visibility is so key to it, that aren't having to kind of hide any aspects of themselves. It's just more, out there, whether it's the kind of positive things, but also to be able to talk about one's struggle.
I really liked what you just said about being 3D. And this is actually my first
Mm.
Trans Day of Visibility out.
Oh, cool.
So I know, really weird. Like visibility is such a nuanced topic, and there is a certain, for me at least, nothing has changed in terms of, I'm not taking any hormones. I'm not. My name is the same as
Mm,
it was. My pronouns are the same. There's just like an addition
mm,
of I went by she, her my whole life, and then I've just added they, them too. And so nothing particularly dramatic has changed for the people around me.
mm,
But for me, this is a really important moment because I finally feel like it, real. I feel like a real person as opposed to
mm,
like a little puppet, and it's a really beautiful feeling. But it's also, it took me a really long time
mm,
to kind of own it. And even now, I've told people who I see every day, and I'm not hiding it from other people, but I've just not said anything to
mm.
anyone else. And so visibility is really complicated, and it's not just a case of popping up and telling people that you're trans or non-binary.
Right.
So, how can you talk about the kind of challenges that come with visibility and like why it's not as simple as that?
Oh, and thank you so much for sharing. I'm so excited for you that, this is your first, Trans Day of Visibility, and I so relate to the feeling real, right? Versus,
Hmm.
uh, kind of playing, or, it's like it can be like even a bit fun. Maybe that's not your experience, but me, you could play around a bit, and it's fine. But there's something very tangible and like landed and grounded in being real. That's, such a cool thing. So visibility, while very exciting and really important in the ways that we've been talking about, it also comes with its challenges, its risks. So it's not simple or straightforward, for everyone, and I would say even for people who are privileged. It can also be, a bit of a, depending on who you're meeting, it's challenging, right? And the
Mhm.
reason why it's challenging is because, visibility comes with safety consideration. So it's still very stigmatized, and I would say even in the current environment, becoming increasingly challenging. And there's pushback on people being trans and non-binary, and there's a discourse happening around, are people trans people real, all these questions and concerns that are being stated and whatnot. And that can place a lot of risk on somebody if they're going to share with someone they maybe don't know, or they've entered an organization where they don't know where, if the organization will have their back. So it can put people in a precarious position to come out and share more about themselves. It's this trade-off between being seen or being safe. And that's a constant calculus that trans and non-binary folks are facing. Now, of course, some folks are visibly trans, in which case it's out there in ways that people react to. But for some, it is a little bit more something they need to share to show to people, in which case there is that kind of calculus that people put in their heads. And I do it myself, and I'm extremely out. It is my job, right? And yet I still, especially with, I just took a trip down to the US. I was very cautious. And, so there I'm trying to minimize my visibility as a trans person. I went
Mhm.
through security and some stuff happened. I recently took a flight. So, there's all these things where we're presented with opportunities to either say something or, remain quiet and either less or not visible as trans folks. So it's not a one and done as you described. It's this constant decision making. And it is
Mhm.
actually very tiring to think through, because we can't know everything or anticipate everything. And so it does make it very difficult. And sometimes I get it wrong, or people in the community that they weren't able to effectively do that, or they didn't have all the factors. And so unfortunately have put themselves in harm's way, right?
Can you talk about the different, I don't want to say levels, but there's different ways of being visible. And so, like I described, how I'm not exactly in, but I'm but I'm not out either.
Mhm.
Like it's sort of I'm in a halfway point, and for some people, visibility just looks different for different people. And could you go into
Yeah,
that a bit?
yeah. Visibility isn't a binary, essentially, right? It's not one or the
Yes.
other. Either visible or you're not, right? And we've done quite a bit of research on this at Transfocus. We conduct surveys among trans and cisgender employees at organizations, and we do ask about being out. And I think we have about 5 different categories of outness. There might be more. I don't know. But there's the not out at all to anyone. And I think people understand that intuitively. And then there's
Mhm.
completely out to everyone, right? But in between, there's a bunch of other categories, right? There are folks who, for example, don't say anything actively, but they're not hiding it actively. There's that kind of
Mhm.
nuanced piece. There's others who kind of share on a need to know basis, right? If it's relevant to the conversation, they'll share. Otherwise, it's kind of a mute point for them. Others share selectively, depending on who they trust or who they know are safe. Otherwise, they tend not to share or tell. Um, and for others, it's more of, I think there was a fifth category, but I'm blanking on it. But there's just gives you some texture of just how many different ways there are to approach this type of thing of visibility, where if people aren't attuned or know to give space for people being trans or non-binary, if they're not themselves, say they're cisgender, then they might totally not get the opportunity to know somebody in a deeper way. And so it's
Mhm.
even the posture that cisgender people have towards others that can either elicit that information or completely skip over it, right? So if people are
Yeah.
making assumptions, I'll just give an example of how people were raised one way or another. That can often provide the space for folks to share more about a childhood that maybe wasn't what they expected, right? If you think about a trans woman, she was socialized typically as a boy, right? And so if people aren't making those assumptions about folks, there's space provided for a trans woman to talk about being raised as a boy, right? Rather than everybody
Mhm.
assuming that she was raised as a girl, right? So things like
Right.
that can allow for more space for folks to share if they want to. Yeah, I don't
Mhm.
know if you have anything else from your experience that adds another category of those different types of the kind of levels of being visible.
I think, well, assumptions are a really big one for me because I was raised a girl and I'm very feminine in the way that I dress and present myself. And so there was never room, like, it actually took me a very long time to acknowledge something wasn't quite right, or I knew something wasn't quite right for years and years, and it was only because I'm around other trans people that I was like,
Mm,
oh, this is uncomfortably familiar. And so somebody I'm very close with went through their transition, and it really shone a light on things that were going on for me. And but even then, it took me years to actually say something. But it was a very deliberate choice to come out when I
mm,
did, because of kind of everything that's going on at the moment, particularly down in the States right now. It was like a very it, it was a conscious choice because it felt like trans and non-binary people weren't getting to give their side, or other people were speaking over trans and non-binary people. Does
mm,
that make sense?
yeah, yeah, yeah. Rather than taking the dominant, well, I don't know if it's the dominant narrative, but certainly the narrative that's being pushed on folks, you're kind of pushing back on that, and it's like, no, this is my story, along with
Hmm.
others telling theirs, right? Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And also, like, there is this idea that non-binary people look a certain way, like that everybody is androgynous, and to be non-binary, you need to dye my hair pink and raise it, like, have it super short, and get into musical theatre. And that's not my story. Love that for the people for whom that is their story, but that's not mine. And that narrative that's being pushed, that, for example, non-binary people don't exist in the first place,
Mm,
and that if they do, they look a certain way and they act a certain way and they are a certain way. And actually, that's not true. There is so much variation with everybody, as there is with cisgender people too.
mhm,
And it was important to me to kind of own it because it feels very intimate for me. I don't know why, but my gender feels really intimate, and so I didn't want to share it
yeah.
exactly. But there was something about having somebody else tell those stories
Hmm,
and make decisions on behalf of other people that made me want to be a bit more visible. What you were talking about with making assumptions about people's past shuts down almost a way of sharing anything about yourself. I felt like I was really keeping a secret all the time when people would make assumptions,
yeah.
or I felt like I was making like a fuss almost.
Mm,
Like, if somebody made an assumption, I would then feel like in my head I was constantly thinking, oh, should I correct someone or should
mm,
I say something? And I almost didn't listen to the rest of the conversation because I was too busy thinking, do I say anything? Do I not say something? And so actually not making those assumptions meant that I never had to do that. It was just, it's an open conversation and I can share the bits that I want to share without thinking, am I going to be making a drama of nothing, or am I going to be moving a conversation in a way that doesn't need to go? Having those assumptions made makes that really difficult.
absolutely. Yeah, I don't think people realize how harmful assumptions are. They think it's like, oh, this little benign small thing, like oopsie kind of thing. But actually
Hmm.
it actually blocks people from each other. It's like a wall that somebody puts up inadvertently. It's not like they're intentionally trying to do that, but they just didn't realize by making a, just kind of jumping into conclusions about who somebody is and based on especially how they look, right? Like looks
Hmm.
is so distracting. And I just wish people would be able to see that. Of course, not just with trans and non-binary folks. I mean, I try to monitor my own assumptions about other folks on other topics, right? Because I'm sure
Hmm.
I'm also creating barriers to other folks by the things that I say. So as much as possible, these open-ended questions where, like you're saying, people can choose their own ability, or how they're feeling that day as how much they want to open up, because you're right, gender is something very intimate, And I think cisgender
Hmm.
people don't realize that about trans and non-binary folks. For them, it's a very public thing. Of course, look at
Hmm.
me, you know, like this is who
Yeah.
I am. It's like, well, cool that society has been set up in a way that allows for that visibility, but it is something a little bit trickier for trans and non-binary folks, where there's a lot more cognitive load. And I love how you broke that down. I mean, I don't love that it happens to you, because that's like a huge amount
For
of
sure.
labor, right? But just those small little adjustments in how we approach each other by reducing or eliminating assumptions can really help get access. Not that we're gunning for access, but it's just more that it's possible. It's a pathway that people
Mhm.
can choose. And that's super important.
When assumptions are made, it almost feels like, I don't know how to describe it beyond, I feel like I've literally just been stripped.
Mm,
Like, as that I'm very vulnerable in front of someone when they've made an assumption about my gender. Being careful with it, it feels like I get to choose the level of vulnerability.
yeah,
It feels great when someone doesn't make an assumption, because it means that I can choose how much of myself I want to share.
mm,
It's a really nice thing to do.
yeah,
It's like a very kind thing to do, in my opinion.
yeah. And people don't realize when they make assumptions, they put somebody in this position of having to either respond, and that response could create unintended consequences that we can't map out,
Hmm.
and or silence, which is a form of self denial, right? And so
Hmm.
that's pretty harmful, to be silent. So it's
Hmm.
just this impossible situation where, either way you go, there's some sort of hit to somebody.
Yes.
And people don't realize that that's at play for folks. And so oftentimes born very silently. And then on top of that, you just layer in the societal discourse. Like, it's just like heavy upon heavy. And that's where visibility, if possible for folks and chosen in their own determined timeline and way, can be very powerful. And like, that can be the spark, the joy, the excitement, is finally I'm able to own my own narrative, and not have
Hmm.
some outside entities, usually quite amorphous, but then also
Yeah.
individuals as well. So yeah, that stuff is super important. And I like how you describe vulnerability too. I think that's key. People don't often realize how sharing about one's gender or history can be so vulnerable. Because for
Hmm.
cisgender people, it's no big deal to share, I'm a woman, I'm a man, end of story, right?
Hmm. And how does that kind of, what have you seen about that showing up in the workplace? Both visibility, but also invisibility as well.
Yeah, we've started to do education sessions on these days with a twist. We've added storytelling as to a part of it, and I think that people are really keen to share stories. We also obviously allow for anonymity, to the point about some visibility is quite risky. So that's a way to protect folks. So it's good to have options available. Some people are okay to have their names, others want to be a bit more sheltered. Totally understandable, especially in a workplace. But there are trans and non-binary folks wanting to share their story, both of things that they really liked about people, these subtle things that you're describing, especially from your story, that really make a huge difference, that people may not realize how kind and how generous and how expansive their approach is, and just highlighting that. Others are, of course, understandably talking about discrimination and challenges, whether access to washrooms or, not able to fill out a form, just any number of things that trans people deal with on a pretty much daily basis. So but it's just allowing them to show up, and to be heard. I think that's very powerful. I think we underestimate how powerful it is to be heard. And we all have a personal experience where we can remember somebody really listened to us, right? And maybe even reflectively, showed caring and active listening by reflecting back what they heard. That just like it really hits at a core. Anyways, that storytelling is very powerful. Of course, that's not the only opportunity for that. If you have a coworker, just being able to get to know them at a good pace, not kind of rushing ahead and wanting to know everything, but then also not, completely ignoring it either, right? So there's kind of fine balance between those two extremes, where you allow somebody to share if they want to. Um, and certainly, other places where we've seen it done really well are surveys. So again, it has that element of anonymity, but still people get to share their experiences, where organizations get a better understanding of what's happening day to day, both what's really going well that you want to keep to amplify that, enhance it, but also to address the things that are going perhaps not so well in the organization. So there's a lot of examples of invisibility within organizations. Again, I don't think for the most part people are intentionally trying to sideline trans and non-binary folks. It's never, or not never, but rarely ill-intended. Now,
Mhm.
the the way that folks are invisible is, in the ways that things are set up or the culture within the organization. Again, assumptions is a big one that we've already talked about, where
Mhm.
then people are put in this tough position of having to respond or not to that incorrect assumption, whether it's assumptions about pronouns, assumptions about somebody's past, usually like we talked about based on how somebody looks. But it can also show up in how an organization is structured. If there's no mention of trans people anywhere in the organization, then people can hardly see themselves in the organization because there are specific things that need to be addressed. I usually just search bar an organization, go in the website of an organization and put in the search bar transgender or trans or non-binary, and if no responses come up, like uh, that's pretty surprising, because there are so many different places where it could show up. Uh, it's also, extended healthcare benefits. Does include gender affirming care benefits, the types of washrooms that are available or not, or even how a form is set up if there's only, one first name field for legal first name. Those are the ways in which the experiences of trans and non-binary folks or the needs are not accounted for. And it literally says we didn't expect trans and non-binary folks to be here to take care of their issues. And again,
Mm.
it's not because people have a vendetta against trans people. It's just maybe not on their radar. They're not aware of how deep seated these issues are. But if you think about gender categories on a survey, if there's, say, a woman is filling out the survey, and if woman was not one of the categories to respond to, what would that feel like? I presume people would, women would be upset, right? And
Sure.
and say
Yes.
something and be like, "Hey, I think there's something missing here." And that's exactly what's happening with trans and non-binary folks. Is now people are pointing out the gaps and the needs to fill in those gaps. So but
Mhm.
every time that happens, there is a degree of invisibility. Some describe it as an erasure, right? So it's just not accounted for, not thought to exist, to be represented in the
Mhm.
various ways that things are set up or the culture of the organization.
Mhm. I want to ask you about representation a bit because the fact that there is no mention of it at all is a really hard one to navigate. Can I ask you about that, or can you go into that
Mm-hmm.
bit?
Yes, absolutely. So, if somebody is joining an organization, they're looking out for folks that share their experiences, their interests, and that might be a number of different things, of which being trans and non-binary is one of them, right? It's not the only thing, but is an important aspect. So if there's nobody else out at an organization, or nobody exists that is trans or non-binary, that puts a big burden on that person. One, they are typically seeing all the gaps that exist and personally experiencing them, saying, "Ooh, what about this? What about that?" And having to ask a lot of questions of HR or their manager. So it puts a lot on them to have to figure out how they fit into the organization, almost literally,
Mhm.
versus if there is somebody who is already there, or maybe even a handful of folks, then that there's kind of an assurance, there's an ease, because typically there's been the path has been plowed, right? If thinking about snow analogies, right? Uh, Walking through snow and trudging through it and post holing, not so much fun. And this is a very Canadian. Uh,
Yeah, I was about to say it's the most Canadian analogy I
uh,
could think of, but
I mean,
go ahead.
yes, continue. Uh, but if the path has been cleared, and it's only fresh in my mind because I did a bunch of snow clearing during my trip in Edmonton, so uh, we have a bit of snow in Vancouver, but not so much as other parts of Canada. And clearing that path, especially having trans and non-binary folks in leadership, is really pivotal because that adds a voice not only for the employees at the organization, who are trans and non-binary, but also actually customers, clients, members of the public that folks serve. Just being aware of what the issues are and being able to speak to those, especially if they're able to be out and to be visible, to be supported in that visibility, can make a huge difference, both for themselves, other employees, but more generally beyond that as well. So, and for the benefit of the company, right? Like it's kind of a triple win in my mind. So that representation is key for people to be able to see out and visible trans and non-binary folks in the organization, and the degree to which a culture or how an organization is set up to allow for that, can either encourage more to come in or discourage, because word does travel in a very small community, and tips and information is transferred about organizations, and some are heralded as great examples, and more people gravitate towards those, and then others are kind of shown as this is probably not terribly safe or a great place to
Mhm.
go.
A lot of work that I've done with Transfocus or that I've read through my work here kind of speaks to this idea that if we don't have any trans people in our workplace, then what? Not what is the need for it,
Yeah.
but maybe it doesn't. People don't think about it until somebody maybe comes out, and then and then everybody's scrambling to try and work out what to do because there are these gaps often. And my experience of this is a little tricky because I work for Transfocus, so obviously things are set up well. But what I will say is that before coming out, working for different organizations or even working for myself with other people,
Mm,
and then I started working for
mm,
Transfocus because I'm surrounded by all of this information and I'm reading a lot and I'm working a lot. It was suddenly in the forefront of my mind in a way that it hadn't been
mm.
before, and that meant that everything sped. I think it sped the process of coming out up quite a lot, to be
Hey,
honest.
that's awesome.
And so I know it's cool. It's funny thinking about. I would have eventually come
Sure.
out, I think, because I'd been talking about it for years before I joined Transfocus. But I wonder where I would be if I hadn't come to work here. But I think that really speaks to this idea that when you do have things set up well, you are going to just naturally invite people to be themselves or be able to be
Mm.
open. It's really important to have this set up before, even if you don't know that there is somebody trans or non-binary in your workplace, that this really needs to be dealt with beforehand.
Absolutely. Yeah, and that's such a good point, and thank you for sharing that because that just really illustrates, once again, the analogy of the plowed path, right? It's just to what degree has an organization made it easy for folks? And it's not just the folks who are about to come out, who want to share more with the organization, but it's actually also for folks who are already out, and for them to know that this is an important and enough matter for an organization to take concrete action and steps. Uh,
Hmm.
and even I know some people looking for jobs will look to see if they have there's gender affirming benefits, or there's supporting trans people, like a toolkit about supporting trans people, or just something, just certain clues that this is an organization that has cares, considers, has thought about, has put something together for specifically for trans, the unique issues of trans and non-binary folks. So that's like a really important thing, to take action on, and certainly proactive rather than reactive. And I know that comes up as a pretty prevailing theme, no matter the topic, whether it's trans, non-binary, or issues of race and ethnicity, disability, and whatnot. But certainly, it's not that much extra effort for such a positive impact, and I think that's what we find when we help organizations with toolkits. Supporting trans people in the workplace, people are really, or organizations are surprised by how positive of a response this has. And usually there's a wave of people who come out immediately after the,
Yeah,
just like, oh,
I bet.
people have been waiting for this clarity, and the steps, and what the organization is going to do, and what the options are, and am I going to have deafening silence, or it's just people do not know what an organization, unless it's explicitly stated, and also by doing the toolkit, that's where organizations realize, oh, okay, we've got a gap here, here, and here. Let's go fix that as well at the same time, rather than having a trans or non-binary person have to like go through that gauntlet of getting whacked at every turn, right? Might as well have the organization figured out so that real live trans people don't have to suffer that, right? So even
Mhm.
those gestures are really important.
That's so interesting that you find that there's a sudden wave of people coming out immediately after putting those things in place. It speaks to the whole point of trans day visibility so well, because as soon as you create this space, there's a whole group of people sort of bubbling under the surface that can't really be themselves until you put these things in place. I think that's so great. I mean, it's not great, but it's so great that there are these sort of options that can make that so much easier for people. And I wanted to ask about, can you also talk to or speak to the way managers and HR can show up in order to create an easier way for people?
Absolutely. So managers in HR or human resources typically play a pretty pivotal role in folks coming out or becoming more visible in the workplace. Usually, folks, employees who want to come out do approach their manager first, because I mean, it depends on the size of the organization, but they typically know the
Mhm.
manager a bit more than HR. So it is good for managers to be prepared for that type of conversation, even maybe practice what you would say in that initial somebody saying, hey, I'm trans or I'm non binary, I go by this name, these pronouns, whatever the information that they're going to share, to be ready to say, hey, okay, this is fantastic. I'm really excited for you. Thank you for sharing. I know this is a big moment for you. Perhaps avoiding the "you're so brave" commentary. I know people really want to be supportive, but it just doesn't really land for a lot of trans and non-binary folks. Again, good intentions, but there's for a lot of trans and non-binary folks, we do not feel brave. This is not about bravery. This is about the necessity of being oneself. Like, it just, we have to do this. It's not a matter of choice. So, and also there's a few other layers there, but in any case, so just having that prepared, allow is gets you in a good position to, if somebody were to share that, you're ready, rather than kind of fumbling your words and being awkward. That usually doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. And then also, HR being ready with, toolkit, policy, whatever you want to call it, that has a procedure set up already. So if somebody shows up, it's like, yeah, great, we've got it set up. Here's some options. Let's set up a meeting to go over them, right? So there's just like kind of a
Mhm.
fluidness to, it's not like this big outlier where people's eyes go big, and you could see them like kind of deer in headlights, like, ah, we don't have anything set up, and there's a mad dash to figure it out, right? um, so just even having, managers and HR, especially those are the ones that have the most intensive work, especially if a first name is
Mhm.
changing, even if pronouns are changing, those can be updated as well. And kind of who's doing what, how are you going to share that with the rest of the organization, if at all, right? So there's different ways that you need to be kind of in lockstep with one another, to support that person coming out and making that visibility possible for that individual. It is an employee driven process, so definitely want to be listening to the individual needs. Not everybody has the same needs, surprisingly. There is diversity among trans and non binary folks. So just being attuned to those and listening and being able to implement whatever it is that, like, for example, some people are okay to share that they're trans or non binary, explicitly stating that to employees. Others, they don't wish to say that. They just say, okay, different name and or different pronoun, whatever the case may be, or an added pronoun. And so it's just kind of walking through that with them and understanding what's just for them to know and what's for others to know. And in that way, uh, visibility can feel like a safe and good thing. But that self determination is key because, as you were noting earlier on in the episode, a lot of trans and non binary lives are kind of taken out of the control. And so to be able to have somebody in the driver's seat allows them that agency that often is stripped from them. So that's a key part of it.
Mhm.
But certainly coming in, because there's a lot of legwork, and to typically trans and non-binary folks, especially those who change their first name or their gender marker, reflecting that in government issued ID is a huge undertaking. And so, just as much as people can kind of take off in agreement, consent of the trans person to take off their plate, so much the better, because there's just so much work that folks have to do. So, there's just a few ways that managers and HR specifically can be supportive in this coming out process.
We were sort of talking about managers and HR, but what about other like colleagues, but also people outside of work, just sort of allies in general? How can they participate in trans day visibility and this kind of these themes of visibility in a way that still centers trans
Mm,
people and non-binary people, so that we don't have that the kind of stuff we were talking about earlier, where it's almost like that narrative is taken away
mm,
from trans and non-binary people often. How can allies participate in a way that honors that and centers that?
yeah. Yeah, that's a good one because oftentimes people think, oh, it's trans day of visibility is just for trans people, when actually it's
Mhm.
a really important thing for allies as well. There are events that happen, usually in bigger cities, but certainly also virtual sessions where people can participate and learn more about the topic, or not just the topic, but the day, and hear people's stories. And people write articles. There's podcasts like this one, but others as well that you can listen to, and just have that deeper understanding as an ally, to understand the diversity that exists, the nuances of the visibility. We haven't even touched some of the cultural dynamics or some things that come up to play when it comes to being visible within different cultures, right? So because
Mhm.
being out can be fairly kind of North American concept, right? And it's not the only way of being one's authentic self. But I think the degree to which people can understand that diversity is really key. Um, if we think about intersectionality, that plays another factor. And so just being able to hear those stories is really key to that understanding. If, say, you're a coworker or a friend, or somebody is trans, or if somebody starts, maybe you don't know if they're trans, but they start to tell kind of more subtle stories, I think it's not just kind of skipping over them. It is listening to them and attuning to them, and then not necessarily asking very pointed questions, but just saying, hey, this sounds really interesting. You want to tell me more about that? Just open ended questions that allow that further unlocking, because strangely, we get to know each other ourselves through dialogue with other people. So you were talking about having a friend that was very pivotal to your understanding. So by that person sharing their story, you heard echoes of your own, and were able to,
100%.
yeah, own it. And there's also things that, like, even cisgender folks, that the things that they say or the questions that they ask can unlock things in us. And so I think friends, family, people who are close to us are really important in that process. Obviously, we're not bulldozing in to the process, but like gently being present to somebody's exploration, unfolding, evolution, that can be really powerful. And to be present for that, um, ask really thoughtful questions, and even open-ended questions can allow people to know that you're interested, that you care,
Mhm.
and for that vibing to happen, uh, and eventually for that person to know you're a safe person to come to when they're ready to share, like, the full story, essentially.
Can I ask you about yourself?
Yeah, yeah,
Is that
yeah,
okay?
sure.
Can I ask you about visibility? Because we've talked a lot about the challenges and also the kind of how complicated visibility can be. But obviously, for you, like your visibility is integral to your job. Like you're very, very visible. You're very, very out.
Yes.
So how does visibility look for you, or do you still struggle with those nuances
Mm.
or those that balance?
Yes, so it is very true. I kind of ultra out, max out, in the sense that I do education sessions, and my introduction includes that I'm a trans man. I describe what that is. I share stories related to that. Of course, that's not the only thing. I try to add more. Um, statistics, stories from other folks, because of course it's a gender spectrum, but certainly trying to have people understand a bit more about what it means to be trans and what that entails. The stuff that struggles, the positive stuff, and whatnot. And having podcasts like this, and occasionally I get called by the media and make statements in the press, and you name it, and I'm out there. Like, you Google me, I show up a lot, right? So, and
He also did a TEDx talk,
oh,
which I feel
right.
like you don't talk about enough. So
I did, and it's so funny. Yeah, indeed, I did do a TEDx talk.
I'm gonna add that to the show notes
I'll
just
will be
so
the
we've got.
plugger of the TED. Yes, so it's kind of very much out there. And speaking of the TEDx talk, one thing I knew, of course, this is kind of a national, international, whatever level, exposure, which there's positive aspects of, like, this can help more understanding among cisgender folks, spread kind of the nuances of that experience, um, you know, promote trans focus. I'll be real. So, but there is the real decision making came when I was like, oh, right, we're going to put this on YouTube. Forgot about that part. And the comment section, right? So you'll see in the TEDx talk, the and I had a very real choice about, like, okay, what do I do with these comments? Do I read them? Number one, because some of them
Mhm,
are not very nice. People have various opinions on the topic of gender diversity. Um, do I read them? Do I ask that they be deleted? On and on. But basically, I decided not to delete them, and not to read them. So there's even visibility of the comments towards oneself too. That also
mhm,
shows up in media articles as well. Anyways, all that to say, in I'm very out in my professional life. When it comes to my personal life, if I'm meeting new people for the first time, I am a bit slow to out myself, which, to some degree, it might not be possible for me not to be out, because they could Google me and come to learn more about me. Um,
mhm.
but I do like the idea of not having to always be trans, um, if that makes sense. Because you can
Yes.
kind of, the visibility is a wonderful thing, but in some degree, it's not the only thing we are,
Mhm,
right? So if kind of like overdo the trans, it's not overdoing it, but it, just to focus on that so much, which is ironic because we're trans focused. But in any case, in my personal life, I do not want to always focus on it, and just be a mountaineer, go running, be a part of all kinds of stuff, go to shows and comedy and whatnot. So uh, I tend to kind of be slower to release that information, knowing that if I share that, which I'm obviously very proud of and very excited, and it's wonderful, but then that means we're only going to focus, or it could mean that we only focus on that. People get stuck there, and I
mhm,
kind of am. I've already done that for the first half of my day. And so the latter half, I really just want to, you know, um, have that just be integrated.
Exist.
Yeah, just exist.
Yeah.
Huh, go figure. It's a bit of a balancing act. And certainly sometimes I don't feel safe with folks, either by comments that they've made, jokes they've made. I keep it very vague as to what I do, because that's usually the outing
Mhm.
piece is, oh, what do you do for work? I'm like, ugh. And I'll say the most vague response is I'm a consultant. And usually, if people aren't curious, they don't ask past that. I'm like, okay, done. The next level will be I'm an EDI consultant, so equity, diversity, inclusion. And if they don't ask further, I'm done. And then occasionally I'll go directly to, I deal with, I'm a consultant on gender diversity issues. So,
We've talked about this earlier, but there is so much vulnerability in
mm,
visibility. Being seen and being known is a really vulnerable thing when it comes to dealing with gender diversity and gender identity. How does that show up for you? Like you talked about meeting new people, but how does that show up for you in other aspects?
yeah. So in my everyday life, there's a few different types of visibility beyond the one that I just described. And one of them is maybe lesser known is, I don't know, there's a bit of like auditory component to it. So, thinking about my voice certainly has changed with testosterone. It has deepened over the years. And in person, more often than not, based on visuals and voice and a whole combination of things, I am properly, identified, or proper pronouns or whatnot, as he, him. Now, one thing on the phone, for some reason, things change. And then I think on the other end, or maybe they see my previous name or something happens where I get a lot of ma'ams, I get a lot of misses and whatnot. So this completely improperly identified.
Does that happen a lot?
Pretty much every call, yeah. So I guess who does not want to make calls?
Right. Yeah, fair
And,
enough.
various, the phone company, or, whoever, internet, banks, I just not a fan of phoning back.
Mm.
I'm like, "Can we do this by email?" "Oh, no, I can't open an account by email." It's that moment we were talking about earlier where, do I say something or do I just let it
Mhm.
slide? Especially if I'm trying to open a bank account, do I need to,
Mhm.
will this create, some sort of challenge in being able to, fulfill what I'm trying to do? So it
Mhm.
really depends in those instances what I do, because that does, out me in a way that I wasn't ready to do, where I don't have to do that
Yeah.
in my day to day life. Of course, I am out at work, but the choice that we were talking about is removed and
Mhm.
taken from me in that moment. And typically, I do say something because I want them to be more attuned to the diversity of callers that they're getting,
Mhm.
and ideally shift away from, gender specific language or making guesses about that, and
Yeah.
whatnot. So that's one aspect where then, there's a visibility that I need to navigate, because somebody has made assumptions about me based on I guess maybe my voice, who knows. Then the other aspect is anytime I go to a gym or a pool, there's the change room to navigate. So my body does look different from other men in the change room, and particularly around top surgery, I do have
Mhm.
visible scars that do draw attention. And so there is this tricky aspect where I am very proud of my body and feels home and fantastic, but it does, raise attention. Some of that, it can be questions. What happened? People want a story to back this up, and that's innocent enough. I don't think that's.
Sure.
I don't always respond to those questions based on my energy level, but then again, there's the kind of prompting to have to explain again, right? Rather than just existing. Yeah. So there's a lot of interesting questions and responses, and stares. Stares is another thing. And then, very rarely, I do get hostile responses as well. where maybe somebody knows what this is all about, or maybe they think it's a sign of weakness. I don't know, but there's something where, there's a very direct type of staring that happens. In one instance, they had a group of about 5 or 6 men have a very loud conversation, and then as soon as I passed, there was just like a settle of silence, right? So there's like things where it's not any like direct violence, but certainly there are subtle and not so subtle cues that um, I'm not welcome, or I don't belong here, right? So those are the
Yeah.
types of visibilities where it's quite precarious to navigate the world as a trans person. Yeah.
What do you think that, like, imagine if we have a future where trans day visibility isn't
Mm.
needed, what does that look like? What can you this is such a weird question, sorry. Like a world where this isn't
Yeah.
necessary, what does that look like?
Yeah, if we don't need trans day visibility, it shows that it's already integrated into the everyday, whether acknowledging and celebrating, people for who they are and thanking them for showing up in as themselves, and being excited for them. Then we don't really need to have that. Certainly, also if there's not a tremendous amount of violence towards trans and non-binary folks, that can also help. Where uh, there isn't this kind of question about visibility and having to navigate and balance it and whatnot, where, as we were talking about a few times, it's just being able to exist and being integrated part of the larger tapestry of humanity, essentially, and where it's not something that's shied away from, and it's also something that's uniquely valuable about somebody, but also not the central thing about them, right? So it kind of ticks all those
Mhm,
boxes of like a full 3D human being, which we were talking about as well, right? Where it's just
mhm,
not such a big deal for somebody to be trans. People understand what it means. People are, not making assumptions. That allows space for folks to show up as themselves when they're ready to do so. We can be connected with one another as well, because as soon as we're having to do the mental calculus in our heads, we're unfortunately disconnected from folks and sometimes ourselves as well. And so
mhm.
just being able to make these adjustments that we've been talking about in this episode can go a long way towards building that type of more positive, more integrated, more connected future.
You mentioned earlier, and I really want to come back to it, about the live sessions that you do for Trans Day of Visibility, because you talked about storytelling. Could you kind of explain what those live sessions look like and what you do
Mhm.
in those?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're doing Trans Day of Visibility sessions, kind of March through April, even though it's March 31st. It kind of spans both of those months. And in those sessions, there's about half of it would be some form of education about trans day visibility, as well as a light refresh on some of the terms and concepts, and a few tips and tools on how to be a good ally, just as a way to help folks in their journey. But then the latter half of the session would be, previously collected stories from folks, usually through an anonymous survey that organizations put out, and essentially allows folks to share their stories, whether they be trans or non-binary, people themselves as employees of the organization, or what we're also finding is allies of trans and non-binary folks, typically family members, but also friends and coworkers that have observed and are sharing from their own allyship journey, and also you know typically this is more trans day of remembrance, but they're kind of distress at the things that they're hearing about trans folks in casual everyday conversations, and this allows them that opportunity to reflect and share what's on their hearts and minds. And yeah, this is just such a powerful, usually there's like 5 or 6 stories, depends on the size of the organization, and that allows folks to reflect the diversity and the the beauty of visibility in a safe way too, right?
Mhm.
And usually there's some also chat that goes on during the storytelling where people are reacting to certain aspects of the story. So it's quite interactive. People can raise their hand and speak if they wish. So it really is trying to engage folks rather than just being kind of passive recipients of, say, knowledge. It's more
Mhm.
engaging them in a conversation about these very important topics. And then typically people have a few kind of questions after the storytelling to be like, okay, what do we do about that? Because sometimes the stories kind of present scenarios where people are like, yeah, how would I react in that situation? And
Right.
so they're like, "Hey, can you clarify that?" So there's a little bit more of like at the end, some teachable moments to, especially if it's inspired based on some of the storytelling, to help out with some of those aspects. Of course, some, especially trans day visibility, will tend to be more positive stories, so that can be very uplifting and enlightening for folks to see as well. So yeah, that's pretty much how the session goes, but it's very powerful, and people walk away very kind of invigorated, inspired to be a part of the positive change that is needed.
I was gonna ask that, like, how is it taken
Mm,
when because that's quite a different way of dealing with these topics, like having that storytelling aspect. How is that received?
mhm. Yeah. So as I mentioned, people feel fairly invigorated. It's very eye opening for folks. Typically, people see trans and non binary issues as maybe this distant, maybe even mystical thing that's
Yeah,
happened somewhere else, but not here.
sure.
And when there's the volume of stories, and it's not just trans and non binary folks, I think people are surprised by cisgender folks showing up and not realizing that trans issues impact cisgender folks because they have loved ones
Mhm.
or people who are close to them, and so that's weighing on their hearts and minds as well. Or they're very excited when something very positive happens, right? So this kind of ripple effect beyond trans and non-binary folks is a big aha moment for folks to realize, hey, they see themselves in those cisgender people that are positive, part of the positive trajectory, and then they feel inspired to follow a similar course, this path that's been created, and are very inspired, or realize just the gravity of the situation by hearing the emotions, the struggle, the joy, all the different pieces. It's not just a statistic; it's a real live human being in their midst that has
Mhm.
these things that, besides fulfilling their counting duties or leaders or
Sure.
whatever, like this is also going on in the background for them. So, or maybe not even
Mhm.
background. It's If it's a workplace issue, it's in the foreground. So, yeah, it's really quite powerful, and it's very well received. People are like, "When are you coming back?" I was like, "Okay, Pride." So, yeah.
That's great. You said something just then that's so true, and I think sometimes this is missed when it comes to visibility, is that or actually any aspect of trans inclusion, is that, these things really affect cis people too. We have such a narrow view of what someone should
Yep.
be, and trans issues span so much more than trans people.
Mhm. Absolutely. Yeah, and that's why, so much of what we're trying to help with in organizations definitely does benefit trans and non-binary folks, but more broadly, it's cisgender folks as well. And
Mhm.
even being able to alleviate some of the struggle from trans folks can also, by ripple effect of the cis people in their lives, also bring down cis stress levels as well. Like
Yeah.
right now, I mean, certainly my family and my friends are asking, like, there's all kinds of stuff happening, whether here in Canada or the US. It's not a like scary time. And
Mhm.
they're worried for me, and so they're just kind of checking in. So the degree to which organizations can be a part of the solution, taking away some of that struggle, will help trans as well as cisgender folks, whether
Mhm.
cis people personally, because they also deal with some of the issues that trans folks deal with, or because they have a loved one or somebody close to them that they're really concerned about. So it really is uh, like has so much benefit. It's, I mean, sometimes a bit too focused, or maybe not too focused, but focused on trans folks, but that doesn't stop there for sure.
Mm-hmm. So do you have any kind of final thoughts on Trans Day of Visibility before we wrap up?
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely really important. And I think it's a good opportunity to go into some of these nuances that we've unpacked here today. Certainly, there are many more. If you talk to another set of trans and non binary folks, you'd get even more richness and nuance and diversity there. But it's really gives hopefully the listener a good insight as to what is at play for folks and what folks are navigating, and how individuals as well as organizations can show up for trans and non-binary folks to alleviate some of that, so it doesn't make visibility so complex and so kind of dire, especially these days. So creating that safety is pretty fundamental to making visibility this wonderful thing, which it is, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's what I would encourage as a kind of key takeaway from today's episode. But yeah, it was really lovely to talk through it. And of course, thank you so much for sharing your story as well, Elle. It's so important because there is such a diversity within such a small community. And it's good to see what that entails.
We have the Trans Day of Visibility resource that I can link. And I'm also going to link to the Trans Day of Visibility live sessions. So yeah, you can check that out in the show notes.
One thing I'll say about the sessions is they're available in English and in French. So, of course, we've got myself as a facilitator, but there's also another facilitator by the name of Ange, who they do lovely, amazing sessions in French. They can also deliver in English as well. But just saying, we recognize in Canada that there are multiple languages, and so we're always wanting to have full accessibility to our sessions.
Where can we find you, Kai, on social media? The question I always ask
Yes.
you, the question you always give a different answer every time.
Yeah, the list, LinkedIn, Facebook, we've got Instagram, Blue Sky, Threads, YouTube, and something else. There's something else. I feel like I'm listing.
I think that's it.
Okay.
I think you've got
Okay.
them.
Whew. And of course, we've got regular postings where, opportunities for micro learning to continue to deepen these pieces. Some of, we mention a topic and then we carry on very quickly. And so you may be interested. What about that? Or you can join our newsletter as well, where we give away even more in-depth resources for folks to explore these topics and get a greater understanding.
You can also email us at podcast@transfocus.ca if you have any questions that you want us to answer, or not me, Kai, to answer. Then just email that too, and we can see if we can slot that into some future episodes. So
Amazing.
cool. It was nice talking to you, Kai.
Yes, same here. Yeah, and thank you so much for listening to those who are listening, and look forward to the next podcast.
See you later.
All right, bye for now.